there are new questions being raised about policing in the U.S. Are police different in the U.S. than they are in other countries? And this conversation is coming up in particular as police responsibilities and powers are expanding globally because of this pandemic that we've been dealing with. So I want to bring in Ryan Heath. He's a senior editor for Politico. You wrote an article entitled, "Are U.S. Cops Different?" And it looks at policing compared to policing in other countries. Ryan, great article. The statistics are jarring. You might not think that policing is very different here, but then when you look at the statistics, when we talk about police-involved shootings and killings, you have to admit that this is a very alarming topic. So I want to ask you, what did you find in your reporting?
Well, what we found is that American police are much more heavily armed than most other police forces around the world, and so are the populations they police. And that is a big factor in this huge number of police killings. But it doesn't mean America is alone in having a problem. So even though Americans die in violent confrontations with the police on the street or in their cars in much greater numbers, it does happen in custody situations, for example, in the jail or the prison in other countries, including Australia. One of the other things that we found is that American police are really not trained in de-escalation tactics, and training hasn't changed a lot over the past 25 years compared to other countries. So you have this situation where the police are very heavily armed, and they go to these weapons much more readily than police in other countries.
I mean, Ryan, all you've got to do is look at the reference point that you use in your article, right? And through your research and through your reporting, American police killed 1,042 people last year. And in the UK, police killings, only 3. So, I mean, it's clear that there is a difference between what police in the United States do and have done versus in other countries, even though other countries are faced with the same crimes. People commit the same crimes here in the US as they commit in the UK or in France. And having lived in a bunch of different countries, including in the UK, including continental Europe and Asia, I can tell you that there are huge differences in policing versus the way that it's done here in the United States. And so the question, I guess, becomes, you know, I've often heard from police officials, especially here in New York City, that they go to other countries and they teach other police forces, international police forces, how to police. But it's clear that perhaps those other countries don't want that kind of training.
Yes. So, for example, in the US, there's not the same consistent social safety net that does exist in some other countries. So you often find the police are left dealing with issues like homelessness, for example. So you don't have experts dealing with problems that require experts. You have the police sometimes stretched out very thin. So interestingly, around this question of should the police be defunded, it's not that law enforcement is particularly well funded in the US. It's sometimes, in fact, that they're expected to do too much and that they don't necessarily do any of it well. And that sometimes the levels of government that are closest to the people are the ones where all of the law enforcement funding is concentrated. So you have a situation where the layer of government that's supposed to be closest to you is delivering services and protection in a very unequal way. And that feeds the sense of injustice and that police are not trusted to serve the communities that they exist to protect.
So in your article, you talk about training and the need for training. There's also this issue about guns and how police are armed here. And in fact, in some countries, police aren't armed at all, or they're not armed widespread. Every officer doesn't have a gun. That's got to be a factor.
Absolutely. So look at something like the UK. It's had a domestic terrorism problem. When you look at the situation in Northern Ireland, when you look at the terror attacks that have occurred in London and in Manchester in recent years, but only around 2% of the police officers there are armed. Even in Ireland, it's only around a quarter of the police officers that are armed, even though they've had these very specific direct problems. You have other countries like New Zealand, where the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, her father is a retired senior police officer. And she came out this week and said she remains totally opposed to the police becoming armed. That's not a solution to the problem. And they too have a very large community of color there, the native Maori community. It's around about the same size as the African American community in the US. And New Zealand has managed to survive without this extra arming. The difference, of course, is that in these countries, you don't have a situation where there's one gun per person, which is essentially the average when you look at the US situation. So cops here do have, they don't necessarily have the right to be fearful of an individual, but it is much more likely that they'll be confronted with an individual who has a gun in the United States than in these other countries where there's a very strict licensing system for the general population to have a gun. So it's kind of this race to the bottom where everyone is fearful of each other in the US.
What about this issue of qualified immunity? Is that present in other countries?
It does exist occasionally, and you do have strong police unions in other countries, but you very rarely have a situation where the police representatives will get on stage at a political rally, which is what happened with the Minneapolis police chief at a Trump rally last year, for example. And then you have this qualified immunity situation, which essentially says that you can have a wide range of justifications for defending yourself or for using violence in the course of your job. And that's very uncommon in other countries, at least in other rich democracies. I want to be careful to say that there's a lot of countries in the world where you don't have a true democracy, where there is a lot of petty corruption and graft that exists in all forms of government transactions, including in the police. So it's not that there aren't these problems in other countries. They're just typically not in the countries that the US would typically compare itself against. So if you want to think of the US as a world leader, as someone setting an example to the rest of the world, the US really is an outlier in some of these respects.
Ryan Heath, really interesting article in Politico. Thank you so much for coming on to talk to us about it.
Thank you.